Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Weddings are supposed to be about love, about celebration, about two people coming together in front of family and friends to start a new chapter of their lives. But as I stood there in the center of the grand reception hall, still glowing from the ceremony, still breathless from the overwhelming joy of finally marrying Jason, my father made sure that for just a moment, the spotlight shifted away from me and landed squarely on my older sister, Claire, just as it always had. He clinked his champagne glass with a practiced ease, drawing the room's attention like a conductor raising his baton before the start of a performance, and with a warm yet careless smile, he delivered the words that made my stomach tighten with something bitter. Something familiar, something I thought I had buried years ago. "We all know that Claire was always the smart one," he said with a laugh, his voice carrying effortlessly over the room, oblivious to the way my fingers tightened around my own glass, oblivious to the flicker of discomfort that crossed my mother's face, oblivious to the subtle shift in energy as an entire crowd of people instinctively turned their heads toward Claire, the ever-perfect, ever-admired, ever-praised firstborn daughter who had spent a lifetime basking in the glow of his approval. I heard a few polite chuckles, a few murmured agreements from distant relatives who had spent years nodding along with that sentiment, who had always seen me as nothing more than the one who was nice enough, pretty enough, charming enough, but never quite enough in comparison to her. The words settled into my chest like an old wound being reopened, but before I could react, before I could even decide whether I wanted to roll my eyes or brush it off with a practiced smile, Jason shifted beside me, his hand resting comfortably against my waist, his expression unreadable except for the sharp glint in his eye, a glint I recognized all too well, the look of a man who had just seen the perfect opportunity land in his lap. And then, in a voice so casual it almost sounded like an afterthought, he smirked and said the one thing that turned the entire night upside down. "Funny," he said, swirling his drink in his hand, his tone light, his posture relaxed, as if he were making a harmless observation. "Because Claire just asked me for a job." The effect was instantaneous, a ripple through the crowd like a pebble dropped into still water, a subtle but undeniable shift in the air as people processed what he had just said, as the weight of it settled in. As every pair of eyes that had once been focused on me suddenly turned toward Claire, their expressions shifting from admiration to curiosity, from curiosity to confusion, from confusion to something far less forgiving. I didn't have to look at her to know what she was feeling, didn't have to turn my head to see the way her carefully composed expression faltered, the way her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the stem of her champagne glass, the way her lips parted as if she were about to say something, about to protest, about to turn it into a joke, but no words came, because for the first time in as long as I could remember, Claire was caught off guard, caught in a moment she hadn't prepared for, caught in a situation where she wasn't in control. My father's smile stiffened at the edges, his brow furrowing ever so slightly as he glanced toward Claire, as if he too had been under the impression that she had it all together, that she was still the shining example of success he had always believed her to be. And in that instant, I knew that Jason had done exactly what he had intended. He had cracked the illusion, had let the first sliver of doubt creep into the perfect image my sister had spent a lifetime crafting, had exposed something she had desperately hoped to keep hidden. For as long as I could remember, Claire had been the golden child, the one who excelled in school, the one who got the scholarships, the one who landed the impressive job straight out of college, the one who moved through life with the effortless ease of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. And me? I was the one who learned to smile through it, the one who watched from the sidelines as she soaked up the praise, the one who was always good but never great, the one who had to carve out my own space in a family that never seemed to notice I was standing right there beside her. And now, on my wedding day, the day that was supposed to be about me, she was the one turning pale under the weight of an entire room's curiosity. She was the one shifting uncomfortably in her seat. She was the one struggling to find the right words while I stood beside Jason, perfectly still, perfectly composed, drinking in the moment like the finest glass of champagne I had ever tasted. Claire let out a soft, breathy laugh, the kind that wasn't really a laugh at all, just a forced exhale meant to fill the silence, meant to smooth over the awkwardness, meant to redirect the attention away from her and back onto something safer, something easier to control. "Oh, Jason," she said, her voice just a little too high, just a little too forced, her lips stretching into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You make it sound so dramatic. It was just a casual conversation, nothing serious." But it was too late, because the room had already heard what they needed to hear, had already picked up on the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her smile, the uncharacteristic hesitation in her voice. And I just stood there, watching her carefully, my own lips curling into something dangerously close to satisfaction, because for the first time in my life, Claire was the one squirming under the weight of judgment. My father, still processing what had just been revealed, cleared his throat and forced a chuckle, trying to salvage the moment, trying to steer things back to something safer, but the energy in the room had shifted, the illusion had cracked, and Claire knew it just as well as I did. As she raised her glass to take a sip, I saw it, the slightest tremble in her fingers, the way she avoided meeting my eyes, the way she held herself just a little too rigidly, as if afraid that if she let her guard down for even a second, everything might come crashing down around her. And maybe, just maybe, it was about to. Even after the wedding ended and the last of the guests had gone home, even after the music had faded and the venue had emptied, even after Jason and I had returned to our hotel suite for the night, my mind refused to settle. Refused to let go of the moment when Claire's carefully curated world began to crumble beneath her feet. I replayed it in my head like a scene from a movie, the way her fingers had trembled just slightly around the stem of her champagne glass, the way she had forced that awkward little laugh, the way my father had shifted uncomfortably in his seat as if realizing, for the very first time, that maybe the daughter he had always placed on a pedestal wasn't as untouchable as he had believed. Lying in bed next to Jason, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years of resentment pressing against my ribs, the suffocating sense of injustice that had built up over a lifetime of being the afterthought in my own family. Claire had spent our entire lives making sure I knew where I stood, making sure I understood that she was the smart one, the successful one, the one who mattered, while I was nothing more than a footnote in comparison. Every achievement of mine had been overshadowed by something she had done first, something she had done better, something she had made sure everyone knew was far more impressive than anything I could ever hope to accomplish. And now, after years of playing that role so effortlessly, after years of looking down at me from the throne my father had built for her, she was finally slipping. I turned onto my side, propping myself up on one elbow, my voice low and careful as I spoke. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my eyes searching Jason's face in the dim light, watching the way his expression remained unreadable, calm but calculating, like he was still piecing together his own thoughts. "Why didn't you mention that Claire asked you for a job before tonight?" Jason exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his gaze flickering toward me with something unreadable in his eyes. "Because I didn't think it mattered," he admitted, his voice level, unbothered, as if the entire situation was nothing more than an interesting footnote in an otherwise uneventful day. "She came to me a few weeks ago, said she was considering a career change and wanted to know if there were any openings at my firm. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured she was looking for something new. But after tonight? Now I'm wondering if she was just desperate." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken, settling into my chest with the weight of something undeniable, something I hadn't been prepared to hear. Claire, desperate? Claire, who had spent her entire life acting as if she was untouchable, as if the world bent to her will, as if she was above the struggles of ordinary people? The very idea of it felt almost impossible, like some kind of twisted joke, yet I had seen the look in her eyes at the reception, had seen the moment of pure panic before she masked it with a forced smile, had seen the way her shoulders had gone rigid, the way her entire body had tensed like a cornered animal realizing there was no easy escape. I sat up fully, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, my heart pounding faster with every new thought that surfaced, every new possibility that clawed its way into my mind. I need to know what's going on, I murmured, more to myself than to Jason, my fingers curling into the fabric of my dress where it lay discarded over the chair. She's hiding something, I can feel it. Jason watched me for a moment, his lips twitching slightly in something close to amusement, though there was no real humor behind it. "And what exactly do you plan on doing?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice laced with mild curiosity. "Call her up in the middle of the night and demand answers? Because somehow I don't think she'll be too eager to confess all her sins over the phone." I shot him a sharp look, ignoring the teasing lilt in his voice, ignoring the way he always seemed to find entertainment in situations like these, situations where people unraveled right in front of him. "I don't need her to tell me anything," I said firmly, my voice steadier now, more certain. "I just need to start looking in the right places." The next morning, I did exactly that. I started with social media, scrolling through Claire's carefully curated profiles, her posts filled with the usual polished perfection, business luncheons, expensive vacations, charity events that she only attended for the photo opportunities. But as I dug deeper, as I scrolled further back, something became clear. There was a gap, a noticeable silence where there shouldn't have been one. The posts that once boasted about high-profile meetings and company successes had slowed, the work-related updates growing more infrequent until they stopped entirely. There was no announcement of a new job, no sign of a big promotion, no indication that her flawless career was continuing on the trajectory she had always bragged about. And that's when I knew. Claire had lost her job. Not recently, not just in the last few days, but months ago, long before she ever came to Jason for help, long before she started wearing that desperate, panicked look behind her usual air of superiority. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my lips as I stared at the screen, at the undeniable evidence staring back at me, at the knowledge that for once, just once, Claire was the one struggling, Claire was the one hiding something. Claire was the one desperately trying to maintain an illusion that was already cracking beneath her. And the best part? She had no idea that I had just figured it out. When I showed up at Claire's apartment unannounced, I knew exactly what I was walking into, knew the game she would try to play, knew the way she would twist and manipulate the situation until it looked like I was the one being irrational, emotional, jealous. But this time, for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking in blind, wasn't stumbling into her carefully laid traps, wasn't falling for the same well-practiced, perfectly performed act that she had used to keep everyone under her thumb for years. I had facts, I had evidence, I had something she hadn't counted on. I knew the truth, and I was here to watch her squirm under the weight of it. Claire opened the door with a glass of wine in her hand, dressed in an elegant silk robe that probably cost more than most people's rent, her expression slipping seamlessly into mild surprise as she took me in, as if my presence was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her otherwise perfectly structured life. But I saw the flicker of something behind her eyes, saw the brief moment of calculation as she tried to decide how to handle me, how to get ahead of whatever storm she could already sense brewing in the air between us. "Emily," she said smoothly, leaning against the doorframe with an air of practiced nonchalance, as if she wasn't the least bit affected by what had happened at the wedding, as if Jason's comment hadn't set her entire world teetering on the edge of disaster. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I assume you're not here to apologize for your husband's little outburst." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, stepping past her before she could try to stop me, my gaze sweeping across the meticulously decorated apartment, the designer furniture, the expensive artwork, the illusion of luxury that she had spent years crafting. But now that I knew what I was looking for, now that I understood what had been happening behind the scenes, I could see the cracks, the subtle signs of a life fraying at the edges, the stack of unopened bills on the kitchen counter, the half-empty bottle of vodka next to the wine glass, the slight tension in her shoulders as she closed the door behind me. "I don't have time for games, Claire," I said, turning to face her, watching as her carefully maintained facade flickered for just a second, the barest hint of annoyance crossing her features before she smoothed it away with a tight smile. I know about your job. Or, more accurately, I know that you don't have one. For the first time since I had arrived, something in her expression shifted, something small but undeniable, a flicker of unease that she couldn't quite mask fast enough. But still, she didn't break, didn't panic, didn't let the truth settle into her face for long enough to give herself away. Instead, she let out a light, airy laugh, shaking her head as she moved toward the couch, taking a slow sip of her wine before setting the glass down on the table with deliberate care. "Oh, Emily," she sighed, tilting her head in that condescending way she always did when she wanted me to feel small, when she wanted to make it seem like I was overreacting, misunderstanding, making a fool of myself. "Is that what this is about? You found out that I left my last position, and you think that's some kind of scandal? People change jobs all the time, darling. Not all of us are content with mediocrity." I felt my jaw tighten, my fingers curling into my palms as I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself not to react the way she wanted me to, not to let her bait me into an argument where she could twist my words, make herself the victim, turn this into another moment where she came out looking untouchable. "You didn't leave your job, Claire," I said evenly, watching as she reached for her wine glass again, as if she needed something to do with her hands, as if she needed to maintain the illusion of control. "You lost it. You got fired. And not just for some minor inconvenience, not because you chose to move on, because you had no choice." The moment the words left my mouth, I saw it, the way her grip on the glass tightened, the way her lips pressed together for just a fraction of a second too long, the way her entire body tensed, like a cornered animal trying to decide whether to fight or flee. "I don't know where you're getting your information," she said, her voice sharper now, no longer playing at the soft, amused older sister act, no longer trying to pretend she wasn't rattled. "But you've clearly been misinformed. You've always had a habit of believing whatever ridiculous gossip you hear, Emily, and frankly, it's embarrassing." I smiled then, slow and deliberate, letting the silence stretch between us, letting her sit with the weight of what I hadn't said yet, letting her feel the moment before I delivered the final blow. "I also know about the debts," I said, watching as her face went utterly, completely still, the color draining ever so slightly from her cheeks, the first real crack in her armor appearing right in front of me. "I know that you've been struggling for months, that you've been trying to keep up appearances while everything around you is falling apart. I know that you came to Jason because you're running out of options, because for the first time in your life, you don't have a safety net, and that terrifies you." For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at me with that cold, calculating expression, as if trying to determine whether she could still salvage this, whether she could still find a way to spin it in her favor. But she knew. I could see it in her eyes. She knew she had already lost. Finally, she let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking her head as she reached for the vodka bottle instead of the wine, pouring herself a drink with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. "And what exactly do you plan on doing with this information, Emily?" she asked, her voice quieter now, lower, stripped of the usual arrogance. "Run to mom and dad? Tell all my friends? Make some big scene to embarrass me?" I tilted my head, considering her, letting the weight of the moment settle before answering. "I haven't decided yet," I admitted, enjoying the way her fingers twitched slightly around the glass, the way she wasn't quite as composed as she wanted me to believe. "But maybe it's time everyone saw the real Claire." And with that, I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving her sitting there in the wreckage of the life she had spent years pretending was unshakable. I should have known Claire wouldn't go down without a fight, should have expected that she would lash out the moment she realized she was losing control, should have anticipated the lengths she would go to in order to salvage the reputation she had spent years carefully constructing. It didn't take long, barely 48 hours after I confronted her. The phone call started, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the way certain family members spoke to me, the tone of concern laced with something sharper, something accusatory. Something that told me Claire had already begun working to rewrite the story, to twist the truth into something that made me look like the problem, made me look like the bitter, jealous sister trying to tear her down for no reason. First, it was my mother, calling under the guise of checking in, her voice carefully neutral as she asked how I was feeling after the wedding, how Jason and I were settling in, how things had been going. But the hesitation in her voice gave her away, the barely concealed worry creeping into her words as she finally reached the real reason for her call. "Emily," she said gently, the way she always did when she was trying to calm me down, the way she always did when she wanted me to be reasonable, to let something go. "I had lunch with Claire today, and she seemed really upset. She said you've been, well, she said you've been spreading some awful rumors about her, and I just don't understand why you would do something like that. I know you two have had your differences, but is this really necessary?" I closed my eyes for a moment, gripping the phone tighter, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself not to let the frustration bubble over. Of course Claire had gone to Mom first, of course she had painted herself as the victim, of course she had leaned into the fragile, wounded act that always worked so well for her, because she knew exactly what to say to make our mother doubt me, to make her believe there had been some misunderstanding rather than an outright deception. "She's lying," I said simply, my voice firm, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "And if you actually took a second to ask the right questions instead of believing whatever version she fed you, you'd realize that she's only upset because she got caught." My mother sighed, that soft, tired sigh that had been burned into my memory from childhood, the sigh she always gave whenever she wanted me to just be the bigger person, to let it go for the sake of keeping the peace, to not make things harder than they needed to be. "Emily, you know how much pressure Claire is under," she said, and it was almost laughable, almost insulting, the way she was still clinging to the narrative that Claire was the one with the heavy burdens, the one with real problems, the one who needed understanding and support, while I was supposed to just absorb the impact of her mistakes and pretend they didn't hurt. "She said you ambushed her, accused her of terrible things, made her feel like she was being attacked. I don't know what's going on between the two of you, but this doesn't seem fair." Something inside me snapped, something deep and old and exhausted, something that had spent a lifetime bending under the weight of Claire's unchecked entitlement, of my mother's refusal to see things for what they really were. "Fair?" I repeated, my voice sharp, incredulous, years of suppressed anger bleeding into the single syllable. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you even realize how ridiculous that sounds? Claire has spent her entire life making sure I always came second, making sure I was always the one overlooked, always the one who had to fight for scraps of attention while she was handed everything on a silver platter. And now that she's finally dealing with the consequences of her own choices, now that she's the one who's losing, suddenly I'm the villain? Suddenly I'm the problem? If she's so damn smart, maybe she should have been smart enough not to lie to everyone who ever trusted her." Silence. A beat too long, a hesitation too heavy, and I knew that my mother didn't have a response, that she wasn't expecting me to push back, that she had spent so many years believing Claire's version of reality that she didn't know what to do when faced with something she couldn't immediately dismiss. But I wasn't done. "You don't have to believe me," I continued, my voice steadier now, colder. "But maybe you should ask Claire why she was fired. Maybe you should ask her why she's drowning in debt. Maybe you should ask her why she went to my husband for a job when she swore she was doing perfectly fine. Or, better yet, maybe you should ask Jason, because I'm sure he'd love to share exactly what his business connections dug up about her." Another silence, shorter this time, sharper, edged with something uncertain, something uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" my mother asked finally, her voice softer now, less certain, the first real hint of doubt creeping into her tone. And just like that, I knew I had one. Because the moment my mother started questioning, the moment she stopped blindly defending Claire, the moment the seed of doubt had been planted, it was over. Claire had spent her entire life carefully crafting an image of perfection, of superiority, of effortless success, but perfection only works as long as no one looks too closely, as long as no one asks the right questions, as long as no one starts pulling at the loose threads that hold the entire thing together. I didn't need to destroy Claire myself. I just needed to give people a reason to look closer. And once they did, once they saw the truth, Once they realized that the golden child wasn't so golden after all, there wouldn't be anything left for her to hide behind. The cracks were already spreading, the whispers already starting, and I could feel it, could see it happening in real time, the slow unraveling of Claire's perfect, untouchable world. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being left behind. She was. There was a certain kind of satisfaction in watching the inevitable unfold, in seeing Claire's world unravel thread by thread, in knowing that no matter how hard she tried to spin her usual stories, no matter how desperately she tried to regain control of the narrative, the damage had already been done. The whispers had turned into open conversations, the doubts had spread like wildfire through the people she had spent years impressing, and the cracks in her perfect facade had widened into something she could no longer patch up with empty reassurances and forced smiles. The truth was out, and there was nothing left for her to hide behind. It didn't happen all at once, didn't collapse in some dramatic, single moment of reckoning, but rather in small, incremental pieces, each one hitting her like a slow, relentless tide of consequences she had never prepared for. Her so-called friends, the ones who had once hung on her every word, the ones who had spent years singing her praises, began to distance themselves, their polite excuses masking their underlying discomfort, their unwillingness to be associated with someone whose name was now spoken with hushed suspicion rather than admiration. Business contacts stopped returning her calls, invitations to exclusive events suddenly seemed to get lost, and the once unwavering respect she commanded in social circles turned to something far less kind, something tinged with schadenfreude, as if people had been waiting hoping to see her fall. But the worst part, the part that I knew cut the deepest, was the shift in our father, the slow but undeniable way his perspective began to change as the reality of Claire's deception set in. As he was forced to reconcile the version of his daughter he had always believed in with the one standing in front of him now. He had spent a lifetime praising her, defending her, placing her on a pedestal so high that I had stopped trying to reach it long ago, but now, for the first time, I saw something different in his eyes when he looked at her, not disappointment exactly. Not outright anger, but something heavier, something more unsettling. It was doubt. And that doubt was enough to destroy her. She tried, of course, tried to salvage what little dignity she had left, tried to play the victim, tried to convince our father that this was all some sort of misunderstanding, that she was being targeted, that I had set her up. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears, the desperation bleeding through in ways she couldn't disguise. And our father, the man who had always rushed to her defense, who had always found a way to justify her actions, simply sat there in silence, his expression unreadable, his hands folded tightly together as he listened without interrupting. I knew, in that moment, that it was over. Because Claire had spent her entire life thriving on certainty, on control, on the unwavering confidence that no matter what happened, she would always land on her feet, would always be the one who won. And now, as she sat there in the suffocating quiet of our father's disappointment, she finally understood what it felt like to lose. She turned to me, then, her expression unreadable, her jaw tight, her posture stiff with barely contained fury, and for a brief second, I wondered if she would lash out, if she would throw one last desperate attempt at salvaging her pride, if she would try to twist this into my failure instead of hers. But no words came, no accusations, no carefully crafted insults designed to cut me down the way she always had, just a long, heavy silence stretching between us, filled with everything she wanted to say but couldn't. And that was when I knew I had one. Because I had never wanted revenge, not really, not in the way she might have expected. I didn't need to see her completely ruined, didn't need to watch her beg for forgiveness, didn't need to drag her through the mud the way she had done to me so many times before. I just wanted justice. I wanted her to finally understand what it felt like to be on the other side, to feel powerless, to feel like nothing she did was enough, to finally know what it was like to watch someone else hold the power she had once wielded so effortlessly. So I stood, smoothing my dress with careful precision, ignoring the way her eyes followed me, ignoring the way our father remained silent, lost in whatever thoughts were running through his mind. I picked up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and turned to leave, pausing only once at the door, my fingers tightening around the handle as I allowed myself one last parting shot, one final truth that I knew would stick with her longer than anything else. Dad always said Claire was the smart one, I murmured, letting the words hang in the air, watching the way her lips pressed into a thin, furious line, watching the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Funny how she never saw this coming. And with that, I walked away, leaving her behind in the wreckage of her own making, knowing that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being overshadowed. She was.